Good afternoon, and welcome to our second Sustaining Belonging workshop hosted by the Associated Colleges of the Midwest. My name is Alan Linton. I'm Senior Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the ACM and hosting this series for today. November 8th is National First Generation College Celebration Day. Today, on the 59th anniversary of the signing of the 1965 Higher Education Act. Over this past week, campuses across the Midwest and around the country have hosted programs to recognize, celebrate, and support our first generation college students, a growing population on our campuses across the ACM and beyond. We wanted to make sure that we provided timely and useful information, research informed, and practical skills to support you in working with and ensuring that these students have the best support and can thrive at your institutions. Our session is recorded and will be made available on our website, acm.edu, under the Professional Development tab. If you have any questions, we'll be here the whole time. I'll be here the whole time. Just put a note in the chat directly to me. There'll be time for question and answers at the end. If you have questions that you want our presenter, Rachel, to answer, put them in the chat. We'll have time to read them out, as well as we'll go over some details at the end on that. I am pleased to introduce to you our facilitator for today, Rachel Gable. Rachel is a higher education researcher and practitioner at William & Mary, where she works with faculty and university stakeholders on academic program development and modification to meet the needs of all students. I am really happy that Rachel's here. Rachel's going to talk about, among other things, her first book, The Hidden Curriculum, first generation students at legacy institutions, and really think about how we can, what we know and how we can better support our first gen students. Rachel, thanks for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for having me, Alan, and I'm excited to participate today. I look forward to questions and answers conversation at the end of this talk. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, if that's okay. And I have a slide deck I prepared that I will share with everyone. And it's a lot of, let's see, it's a lot of info, but we're going to go through it fairly quickly. If you have questions, make sure you throw them into the chat. Alan's going to kind of monitor the questions in the chat, and I'll make sure that we get to those at the end of our presentation. So if I can just briefly give you, first I'll actually, here we go. Come on now. Okay, so a brief outline of today's conversation, my presentation first, and then our conversation. I'll give you a brief introduction of how I got into this research with first generation college students at what we might call legacy institutions, or institutions that have a high proportion of students who have a personal or family connection to that institution, or who have traditions that are kind of relevant to continuing generation students more than first gen students. And then we'll talk about the definitions of first gen, demographic trends, and then I'll get into the research that informed my study on questions about how first generation students vis-a-vis their continuing generation, or peers who have at least one parent who graduated from college, feel about their college going experience, how do they respond to their college going experience, and how do they reach out and connect for assistance and support, and what faculty and staff can do to encourage that kind of help-seeking behavior, but also how they can be proactive in supporting our first-gen students. I'll also talk a little bit about the hidden curriculum on campus and how you can interrogate it, and we'll wrap up with any kind of Q&A or conversation after that. So clearly I'm not so great at the Zoom move, sorry, on the slide deck. Can everybody see my slide deck, Alan, or is the slide deck? Okay,
Yep,
great.
look good.
All right, excellent. I'm gonna move you all so I can see my slide deck myself. So first and foremost, you probably are all very much aware of this. There is a move to unify the term first generation on college campuses. Federal kind of response to NCES and other institutions are trying to figure out how can we codify this in a way that is uniform across campuses in the United States. However, the move to unify, the term first generation is inconsistently applied, and it's also not always appropriate or relevant depending on the college campus. And so we have to be subtle in our ways of thinking about how do we support our students who feel as though they are first gen, but maybe don't show up in the record as first gen. Typically, we say that a first generation college student is a student who has no parent who is a graduate of a four-year institution. However, we have a number of students whose parents attended professional or trade schools, either abroad or in the US, who feel as though they are not first gen. We have students whose parents attended colleges and universities abroad and they don't understand the college going process in the US, and so they feel that they are first gen in the United States context. Or there are students who may have other relatives, say grandparents, who graduated from college, even though parents did not graduate from college. Again, we have instances where students say, my parents died young and I wasn't raised by a parent who is a graduate. I was raised by a grandparent who's not a graduate. And so I feel as though I am first gen, even though I'm not counted as such in my college, by my college or institution. So this is just a way of saying that there's greater complexity than the definition allows, although it's good to try to capture your first generation college students. We also need to have an understanding that there is a capaciousness around the edges and information and activities that actually can support students who are all but the name or who feel as though they can also be supported by or participate in any kind of resource development or programming that would be supportive of first generation students. Briefly, the first generation demographic is a very broad demographic. It includes rural and urban students, students from all religious backgrounds, political backgrounds. We have students who are first in their family to be American born. We have immigrant students. We have many generations of Americans. So it is not the case that our first gen students all cohere to a very specific set of identity features. We'll talk briefly about demographic trends among first gen, but to remember that as a group, as a whole, it is a very diverse set of students. In my study, for instance, close to 50% of first generation students in the study that I did said that they did not feel like first gen as an identity factor was the primary identity factor that they brought to campus. And so other factors were far more important to them. For instance, their race or ethnicity or their gender. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Um, and finally, different campuses have different proportions of students who are first gen, and that matters. And so we'll talk a little bit about the salience of being first gen on an institution, on a campus where there's a low proportion versus a high proportion of other first gen students. So nationally, and in this also coheres internationally as well, if you have an interest in international higher education, the demographic trends among today's first generation students are such that they are a majority female. Majority of our first gen students are also students of color who would identify as students of color. The majority are also public high school graduates rather than private or parochial high school graduates, and they are more likely to have a military veteran or dependent of service member identity. And they also may bring with them a history of having moved, in part because of that, to different parts of the US, and so have different experiences in terms of mobility. They are more likely than our continuing generation students to be first gen American as well as first gen college students. And there is a higher proportion among our first generation student going on the national trend to come from limited income or even Pell eligible backgrounds. They are also more likely to be caregivers, either in roles as parents or in roles as caregivers to other family members. And so they have strong connections at home that require a certain level of responsibility that you might not see among all of your continuing generation students. Now, these are likelihoods, not obviously, strict outcomes. First generation college students, I love that Ellen started talking with the Higher Education Act. It used to be the case that a very high proportion overall of our college going segment of the United States population post World War II was first gen. So if you take a look at the longitudinal data on first generation college students, we had a period of explosion of a very exciting moment in time where opportunity was expanded, and many students who were the first in their family to go to college went to college. Its peak was in the early 1970s, and since that time, we have had a slow decline among our total proportion of our student going body as first gen. Now, in some ways, we could say, well, that makes sense because, of course, if you are first generation, say in the 70s, and then you have a child, your child is no longer first gen. So we would be shrinking that pool. However, we have a growth in students who come from other from backgrounds that were excluded from college going in the 60s and 70s, who now should and could be eligible for four-year institution college going. And so there is still a good deal higher proportion of students who could go to college, four-year college, who do not elect to go to a four-year college, who would be first in their family. In addition to that, we have an ever increasing number of students who come from international or first generation American backgrounds, who again could benefit from a four-year institution in the United States. And so that shrinking of the pool shows that we have room to grow in terms of recruiting students who come from first in their family backgrounds. But what are some of the headwinds? I'm going to talk briefly here about, economic trends nationally, and then talk about economic trends on campuses. So this is a quick slide just to remind everyone that there is inequality in the United States. I'm sure that that's first and foremost on all of our minds. And so, I almost feel embarrassed to point it out, but it's always a good reminder that the proportion of our households that come from the different quintiles in the United States, the gap is widening among the top 20%, the top quintile. So if you take a look at this quick trend here, the very top dotted line is the top 5%. I'm going to show you a slide that includes top 1% households and top 20% households, and then everybody else. So that top 5% household is really rocketing away from everyone else in terms of income in the household. The top quintile is that purple line below. Then again, it has pulled away from the other quintiles. And as you see, in real terms, the four other quintiles, like 80% of US households, really haven't seen actual growth in terms of household income, inflation adjusted income, in many decades. And we can see the top 1% continues to grow. I created this slide 2 years ago, and I had to update it this year because 2 years ago, the top 1% household earners were at 650. Now that's 682. It just continues to grow. So that's just a large socioeconomic background to get us to why does it matter on our campuses. So I pulled up. I'm going to talk briefly or for the next 20 minutes about Georgetown and Harvard, which were the locations of the case study that I'm going to talk to you about for first gen. But I also pulled up 4 ACM schools. These are real schools in your pool. And I looked at the mobility report card data that's on the New York Times. It's been around for quite a few years now. It's really interesting information that shows what proportion of a college going class in any college or university in the country come from the top 1%, the top 20%, and the bottom 20%. And you can extrapolate who comes from the middle 60 from those numbers. And so if we look on the left-hand side, we can see the socioeconomic proportions of our students in Georgetown and Harvard, where I'm going to talk about briefly. And do you see, you cannot see oh dear, you can't see, oh, it's it's in the middle. Do you see the top 1% is the blue part of the bar graph. And the top 20% is the orange part of that bar graph. So if you include the blue and the orange together, for instance, at Georgetown, Uh, Close to 80% of students at Georgetown come from that top quintile. 15% or 18% come from the top 1%. Remember that last slide I showed you? $685,000 a year household income come from the top 1%. That's that blue on the far left. And even the top quintile is radically wealthier than everyone else. So the gray and the yellow, the gray proportion is your proportion of the what we would think of as a traditional middle class, the mid 60% in the United States. And there's been a number of really interesting research studies that show that at elite, especially private institutions, but also public institutions suffer, our middle income students are actually being squeezed. We're seeing fewer and fewer of them in highly selective private institutions. And in part, that's because the top quintile continues to produce students who are who would take those slots. The bottom 20%, the lowest income households, are still woefully low in terms of the percentage. Looking at Harvard and Georgetown, it's about Harvard has 4.5% of their students come from the bottom 20. Georgetown has about 3. And I pulled up the ACM colleges, and they range between 1.5% and 3% in these four. I didn't look at all of them, but pulled up a fairly representative sample among high, middle, and low in your ACM group. If you look at the bar graph on the right, that's the proportion of students who come from first generation backgrounds. So our ACM college number 1, which you'll see has the highest proportion of students who come from middle income backgrounds, it also has the highest proportion of students who come from first gen backgrounds. So if you are thinking, I want to support first gen students, you're also supporting middle income students, people who come from working class families or middle income families who are striving and college ready or college willing. Proportionately, we have a much better work or greater work that we could do in our colleges that also have students who come from high income backgrounds. As you see, the higher proportion of high income backgrounds correlates with a lower proportion of first gen students on your campus. And these data are collected on the left from Rod Chetty and Opportunity Insights, and on the right from the college enrollment websites themselves. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that led to the hidden curriculum, and we're going to talk about what to do. So I did a 4-year longitudinal study with 2 cohorts of students. We interviewed them as sophomores and again as seniors. And the students were first generation. They're about 95 students were first gen, and about 35 students who were continuing gen. We had a higher number of students in the overall study, but those were the ones who participated for 2 cycles from beginning to end in both cohort years. And we followed them through time and asked them the same battery of questions. How did you feel about college? Did you feel like you were as prepared as your peers? If not, why not? What kind of resources could we have provided you or people that you think would be supportive of first generation students in general? What was your social life like? What were some of your greatest academic successes? What were some of your greatest academic challenges, social successes and challenges? And we found that a higher proportion of students, about 40, a little less than half, 44% of students who came from first generation backgrounds said that they felt less prepared than their peers for college. And so they wanted additional, in particular academic, but also social support. About 1 in 5 continuing generation students also felt that way. Okay, so we have a decent enough proportion of students who come from families who have parents who went to college who say, I too could use a lot of help. So that was about 1 in 5. The interesting finding on a longitudinal study was that the percent grew between sophomore and senior year for our first gen students, but it stayed the same with our continuing gen students. So 1 in 5 seniors among our continuing generation students said, yeah, I felt like I was less prepared for college. Basically, the same number of students felt that way. But our first generation students, they came back to us and said, we didn't know what we didn't know. And we wish we'd had more support earlier on. We didn't realize that as sophomores, but by the time we're ready to leave college, we wish we'd had these sets of additional supports. And I'm gonna get to those supports later. The other thing was if you were first gen and had another identity factor, for instance, if you came from an underrepresented minority status background at a school that was a PWI, or if you came from a public high school that had a high proportion in a college that had a high proportion of students who came from private schools, or if you were female, or if you any number of single identity factors affected your sense of how you felt prepared. Our first generation students who came from private high schools, they were below the average in terms of feeling less prepared among their first gen peers. And our continuing generation students who came from public high schools were above the average for all continuing generation students. So those factors played a role. In addition, intersectionality turned out to matter a great deal. So if you added multiple factors and looked at it, for instance, if you were first gen who came from a public high school who was also Latinx or Latina or Latino, and if you were female, the proportion of those students who said, I felt less prepared for this particular context, either academically or socially, rose pretty dramatically. And so it indicates that we could also, in addition to providing supports that would help all of our students, we can focus targeted efforts on students who we think might want or benefit from greater supports within the larger pool of first generation students via celebration, via peer mentorship. The next thing I want to talk about briefly is how are students who felt that they self-assessed either as or more prepared than their peers or less prepared than their peers, how they talked about their habits in terms of college going, because that's what we want to know. We want to know, how are our first generation students proceeding through college? Is it different than the way continuing generation students are proceeding through college? And can we help support all of our students so that everyone feels that they have the access, the resources, and the benefits that our colleges can provide them? So the students who disclosed to us that they felt more as or more prepared for college, who were first gen, talked about how they often studied in groups, asked for help, went to the resource center or tutoring center, asked their friends to help them with projects or studying for major tests, asked their professors for help. In general, they treated help seeking as a right and as a sign of their continued success. And I want to slow down on that. Help seeking is a sign of continued success. It is not a sign of failure or of a lack or of you're not belonging, right? So our first gen students who took that attitude of I'm going to get all the help I can get here really, really thrived. And they also tended to feel as though they were as or better prepared than everybody else because they were taking advantage of all of the supports. They sought out friends among diverse peers. They did not self-segregate only among first-gen students. They found mentors among their faculty, and they took opportunities outside of their social class backgrounds. So they reached into themselves and said, do I really want to study abroad, even though nobody in my family has a passport? Or do I want to try out for mock trial or the debate team, even though it appears to cost a lot of money? Maybe I can get resources so it doesn't cost me anything to go on these national competitions. Those students who disclosed that they felt less prepared had the kinds of habits that we would like to discourage among all of our college students. And we want to be very sensitive and careful as we're thinking about supporting our students who feel less prepared, that they can feel comfortable enough to ask for help. They tended to study alone. They avoided questions in class. They didn't raise their hands as often. They treated help seeking as an entitlement of people who were better off financially than they were, or they treated it as a weakness. I was a tutor in my high school. I was the one who people came to for help. Now I'm here and I need help. That's not right. That's the kind of attitude that they would have. They cultivated only friendships among like-minded or similar background peers. and they avoided the faculty outside of their classrooms. They tended to think of things like study abroad as wasteful or just things that their families didn't do. So as we were thinking about ways to support our students, and I'll get to this in a couple of slides, those students talked a lot in their senior year about reaching out early and often to not only the students, but also to their families to talk to them about how these kinds of outside of the classroom activities like study abroad can help with careers much in a much more compounding way than just academics. And in this slide, I want to briefly talk about a comparison. So the last slide was about first-gen students who felt more or as prepared versus those who felt less prepared for college. This is a comparison between continuing generation students and first-generation students. So just straight off the board, when we asked what were your greatest successes academically and socially in college, pretty much across all student body, all student types, they came up with the same or similar kinds of responses. So everybody had a paper that they wrote that they were proud of. Everybody made a best friend, friend for life, right? So these, what was your greatest achievement type questions tended to have, there was very little difference no matter what your background was. Our first generation students were the only students in this longitudinal research study to talk about academics in terms of a roller coaster. They usually had a turnaround story. I started with an F and I ended up with an A minus, right? Um, Not to say that continuing generation students don't have that experience. They just didn't want to say it in the interview, right? So our first gen students talked a lot about the roller coaster, in part because they were proud of that roller coaster. Look at how much I've grown. And that's something that we as institutions can harness, right? Like we all want to celebrate growth. And our first generation students have really great growth stories to share, and we should encourage our continuing generation students to have those stories as well. So they did talk a lot about their academic struggles leading to a sense of not belonging. In addition, at the time of the study, there was a lot going on, and there's also a lot going on now. I think politically and economically and socially, this country will have a lot going on for the foreseeable future. So our first generation students spoke at length about how they had difficulty connecting home and school. So supporting our students with that connection between home and school. How does it feel to go home for Thanksgiving and then to come back? Especially when we have politically charged conversations or uncomfortable conversations that make a student feel as though they're becoming different than their home family expects them to be. There is always the potential for identity change. And our first generation students were also the only in our group to talk about money and finances as factors that influence their academic decisions. So our academic choices, like what kind of major you will major in, that's a very common challenge for our first generation students. Whereas our continuing generation students, it's not that they don't think about finances or money when they're thinking about their academic choices. It's just they don't frame it that way in the interview context. So our continuing generation students, what they wanted to complain about is, can you get mom and dad off my back? There was a lot of describing their parents as helicopter type parents that they wanted to separate from. They also, interestingly enough, spoke of their academic experiences as less of a factor in their decisions about what to do post-college than our first generation college students. So they talked at length about their extracurriculars or their summer internships more than the great paper that they wrote or the major that they've decided on. In terms of our academic and social behaviors, our first generation students, and this helps us to understand where we can target support, right? They're less likely to participate in high impact practices. So as I'll show you in a few slides from now, when we ask for advice from our first generation students, what can we do to support first generation students like you to feel like you make the most out of college? Fund those high impact practices targeting to our first gen students, targeting recruitment and also participation enrollment, either through national scholarships, such as the Gilman Award for study abroad, or summer programs like research experiences, undergraduate research experiences that target first generation college students. Things like that are great targets for helping our first generation students to thrive in college. They were also less likely to write a thesis or to participate in supervised research. So again, we want to think about how we target recruitment for supervised research to support our first gen students. They were more likely to indicate that they wanted a faculty mentor, but they were less likely to know how to seek one out themselves. So finding programming to support faculty mentorship with our first generation students was key. Our continuing generation students, and I know we're not here to spend a lot of time in supporting our continuing gen today, but they also asked for help. Can you get mom and dad off my back? Um, can you help me to identify my extra and co-curriculars through my career prep? And help me better understand the potential for human transformation through my academics. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears to the title of the presentation, the title of my book. What is this thing we call the hidden curriculum? Briefly, it is all of the tacit norms, expectations, the hierarchies that we take for granted in any kind of institution. Even at the K-12 level, maybe even at the pre-K level, every educational institution has a hidden curriculum in addition to its overt curriculum. So you can go look at the catalog and you can see what are the expectations for graduation at the catalog, but there's also always ever this kind of shadow curriculum that is that expects and rewards for success a certain set of behaviors and practices. Now, our first generation students are more likely to trip over that hidden curriculum, but they're also more likely to help us to interrogate it and to potentially change it. Um, what is valued at our institution? What is normal? Is it universal? These things that we think of as universal for our institution, are they universally beneficial to all of our students? What can we do to interrogate the naturalness of the norms that we expect of our students? And we ask ourselves, how does that help us to become a more accessible, more inviting place for students to thrive academically and socially and developmentally in these 4 or more years? Where do we spot them? We can spot them in open houses or promotional materials. We had a number of first gen students in the longitudinal study that I was in talked about how even the admissions events, the summer admissions events, they would have them at country clubs or a wealthy person's home rather than at a public park or someplace that was convenient and easy for everyone. Campus offices, classroom layouts. Is your first gen support group in the basement of the library? Because if it is it pretty? Is it fixed up nicely? Does it look resourced the same way that your other offices are resourced? And what kind of informal relationship or informal rules related to time do we have? And do our first generation students know that? At one of the institutions we worked with, everybody was 7 minutes late. And that was considered the norm. In some cases, everybody's supposed to be exactly on time, and that's considered the norm. What are norms for campus speech, classroom speech, office hours, extracurricular participation? In terms of extracurricular participation, some highly selective institutions also have highly selective extracurriculars. And so you think as a first generation student, gee, I spent all this time trying to get into this really highly selective college, and now I want to join the newspaper, and you get rejected because there's this habit and attitude that competition is and selectivity is what shows value, right? And so you get to these highly selective institutions and sometimes you can't participate in extracurriculars, and that's really very problematic and challenging for our first gen students and for all of our students, quite frankly. And again, finally, dress code, comportment style, all these things, we want to interrogate those. How does an expectation for the way we look, the way we dress, bring in a sense that one group of people is normal and another group of people is not part of the norm of what's accepted on campus? So we asked the college students in the study, how do you unearth these tacit rules? And what would you say in terms of lessons learned? And I know there's a lot of words on the page, and I'll send this out later. But our first gen students talked a lot about getting to know their faculty at office hours, figuring out how to wayfind on campus, figuring out all of the campus resources, understanding how you fill your time outside of class, how you feel, how you come to feel comfortable speaking up in class, that you have a right to speak up in class. And again, or finally, getting off campus and getting outside what we might think of as the bubble of campus in order to refresh and to feel more strongly connected to the campus. We had a number of students, first gen, who studied abroad, and they said that they never felt like they belonged on campus until they studied abroad. When they went away, that was when they really got this sense of identity and school spirit. And when they returned, they felt much more confident on campus. We have some number of factors that actually compound or affect belonging even before or during the experience of college going that is separate from the experience of college going that we should take into account. Students who come from different high school resource backgrounds will have a different sense of their belonging or ability to access resources on a college campus. So your high school experience matters for college itself. Any kind of pre-college experiences, if you've spent time on a campus, college campus before, that will affect whether or not you feel comfortable on that college, on a college campus. First gen students with older siblings or friends or family members who had gone to a college or that college felt more comfortable. Students who had off-campus commitments that got them involved in a community felt more comfortable on campus. And this, I know this sounds somewhat silly, but if by the beginning of your senior year you have an idea about what you want to do after college, you feel really comfortable about your college going experience, right? We all feel much better when we know what's going to happen in the future. Um, Okay, so my last two slides are, I think yeah, I've got three slides. And I know we're coming short on time. Alan, can you help me? I don't see the clock.
You have about 20 minutes left. So
Oh,
you're doing great.
20 for the presentation?
20 for the whole thing. So
Oh, okay, so 5 minutes
yeah,
for the
5 minutes
presentation.
for the presentation.
5 minutes. Okay, so I've got three more slides. One of the things that we did in the interviews was we asked students,
All right, bud,
what did you do?
do my webinar, but I hope you have a good weekend. Do you have any?
What would you do if you were, a decision maker for a day on campus, dean for a day, in order to support first generation college students? And these were some of the top recommendations that came from our first gen students themselves. So they wanted multiple opportunities to frame out college, in particular the liberal arts experience. And I'm speaking to a group of colleges that predominantly follow a liberal arts model. So our first gen students talked a lot about how they didn't quite understand what the liberal arts were before they arrived on campus, but they really appreciated learning over time opportunities for how to frame that, how to talk about the liberal arts to their family members, to potential employers, to talk about the value of the college going experience that they had. It helped them feel more comfortable about their own experience while also feeling more confident about what it is that they were doing. The kind of is it worth it question. They also wanted to see more first gen students who came from high achieving backgrounds to be in leadership roles, both in academic mentorship roles, but also extracurriculars. So could you recruit, leaders among your first gen students to be the admissions guides or the recruiters for different clubs on campus, or as peer mentors in academic programming, to target your recruitment to get your high achieving first gen students to be models and mentors for all of your first gen students gives a sense of pride, a sense of belonging, a sense of achievement. If they can do it, you can do it, right? And they come from a similar background as you. So this is very similar to the same idea of having your faculty and staff flag themselves as having been first gen. Also recruit your older students to say, look, I'm a great success and I'm first gen and you can be too. If you have any time and resources for this, creating and cultivating opportunities for faculty members to spend out of class time with our first gen with all of our students, but our first gen students in particular, really supports our first gen students. So lunch, coffees, a symposia with dinner, these kinds of less formal ways to get to know faculty are highly valued among our first generation students. If you haven't already, interrogate your signage on campus. Are there a ton of acronyms among your signage? How do people know or understand what a building is meant for? Does it just have the name of a long dead person, or does it explain what it is? Think about wayfinding on campus. Where's the history department, for instance? And then finally, we already talked a little bit about this, but put your first gen students as often as you can in videos, in recruitment materials, so that our first gen students feel as though they too are participating in the narrative of the story of the college itself. Okay. I was asked to talk about what faculty can do, and I hope you don't mind that I'm focusing on what faculty can do, particularly in the classroom context. Again, these bullets come directly from our students. These are pieces of advice that our students have provided. If you could help faculty understand what kind of help you need, these were the responses that were given to us. I don't understand the syllabus and I don't understand the assignments. So interrogating our syllabi, eliminating any assumptions in our syllabi, making sure that they're clear, comprehensive, maybe have an outline for what the weeks of the course will be like. Not every faculty member spends time on a week by week outline in your syllabus, and that's highly appreciated by your first gen students. Also evaluating your office hours practices. Some faculty have turned office hours to student hours to help students understand that this time is dedicated to them. Um, what's your opinion on drop-ins? Do you require appointments in advance, or are you okay with students coming in an open door policy? If you need an appointment in advance, maybe you have schedule conflicts or children that you have to get from school, making sure your students know why, so that they're not experiencing it as you turning kind of closing the door on them, but rather I'm excited to talk to you, but I need an appointment because I have other scheduling conflicts and I want to make sure that I'm not conflicted when I see you, student. Revisiting your classroom expectations for participation in terms of verbal participation. A lot of our first gen students, especially in the beginning, first couple of years, have great difficulty speaking up in class. And so we're already hindering them when we grade them on their verbal participation. This has been talked a lot about by a lot of smarter academics than I, but evaluate your expectations for the time and money students have for the kinds of resources that you expect them to use for class, including your books. Low-cost books, no-cost textbooks are a fantastic resource, but also just what are we thinking about when we put together the activities that we have for a class or the lab work that we have for class? Are we thinking about our lowest income students at this time? Or are we thinking about our students who may not be from low income backgrounds, but who have multiple expectations on their time and money? And finally, interrogate your approach to internships and research and lab experiences. Most faculty, not out of malice at all, tend to ask the most verbal and most willing and engaged student to participate in a lab or a field work study or some kind of internship that they have available to them. But that's not always assisting our first gen students who may not even know how to ask or find those kinds of opportunities. So if you can interrogate the maybe summer research lab practice or your undergrad lab practice and say, am I opening this up in an application-based way so that anyone can apply to join my lab? Or am I only ever going to the same kinds of students and asking them to join my lab because they are recognizably engaged to me, right? So engagement may look differently for our first gen versus our continuing generation students. We want to make sure that those high impact practices are open to all of our students, and it may require a shift in the way we think about recruiting for those. Finally, how do we support our students outside the classroom? We know that extracurricular participation is so important, especially for snagging that first job. We want to be thinking about how are there any financial barriers to extracurricular or co-curricular participation on our campuses? We want to make sure our students are getting opportunities for project management, for leadership. These are things that they do in the a cappella group or on the soccer team, right? So they are participating in ways that enhance their academic experience and give them models and formulae for snagging that first real job after college. However, our first generation students are less likely to participate in our extracurricular opportunities on campus. So how do we bridge that gap? Getting our students both to participate, but then also to join in a leadership capacity. One of the reasons why it's so difficult, or not difficult, it happens, it's so habitual that first generation students tend not to become the presidents of their extracurricular, is because there's this tacit expectation that the leaders will spend money in the extracurriculars. So how do we support via our university funding structures those extracurriculars so that the leadership, the presidents of the clubs don't pay out of pocket for activities in order to socialize or to bring the rest of the group together. Supporting our students as they're developing their personal and interpersonal relationships. That's core and key function in student affairs offices. So thinking about how we can support the social and interpersonal development through student affairs programming is always key. That supports every student, not just first gen students, but it has an outsized benefit to our first gen students. And then also programming that are related to what we might think of as adulting. So budgeting and maximizing your work-based opportunities on campus should not be things that we avoid, but things that we talk about with our students. So an example being, if a student is secures an on-campus job that pays $8.50 an hour and they're really excited about it, but then another opportunity comes also on campus that's $12 an hour, encouraging our students to think about time and money commitments so that they can maybe aim for that $12 an hour job and to not feel guilty about turning down the $8.50 job. We also had a number of our first gen students talk about things like coat closets, professional dress. If on your campus you do not yet have a coat closet or a professional dress closet for interviews, that's something that a number of donors always enjoy giving professional dress to a college or university so that our students, in particular first gen and low income students, can have ready access to high quality clothing so that they can go to interviews, maybe even walk away with the clothing, not have to return it, but that they can go to interviews and also participate in on-campus activities such as internships that may require more professional dress. So those were just a few of the top level recommendations that come from first gen students for supporting them outside of the classroom context. Happy to talk about any number of other directions. We had a lot of direction in the research study. I hope at some point, if you have an ebook in the library, of a copy of the ebook of the hidden curriculum, if you want to reach out to me with any questions via email, I think I'm available on the internet, so you can find my email address pretty quickly. But we went in a number of directions in the book that I didn't cover today, including supporting international students, including supporting students who come from extreme distances. So like if you have a California student who's on an East Coast campus and can never go home, those kinds of questions are relevant to supporting first gen as well. I'm going to wrap up now so we have time for questions. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so very much for was a tremendous presentation. I'll kind of stay out the way. I'll stop recording here. So I'm just going to turn this off.